Chapter 13 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13. Rachel. A candle faintly burned in the window to which the black ladder had often been raised for the sliding away of all that was most precious in this world to a striving wife and a brood of hungry babies, and Stephen added to his other thoughts the stern reflection that of all the casualties of this existence upon earth not one was dealt out with so unequal a hand as death. The inequality of birth was nothing to it. For say that the child of a king and the child of a weaver were born to-night in the same moment, what was that disparity to the death of any human creature who was serviceable to or beloved by another, while this abandoned woman lived on? From the outside of his home he gloomily passed to the inside, with suspended breath, and with a slow footstep. He went up to his door, opened it, and so into the room. Quiet and peace were there. Rachel was there, sitting by the bed. She turned her head, and the light of her face shone in upon the midnight of his mind. She sat by the bed, watching and tending his wife. That is to say, he saw that some one lay there, and he knew too well it must be she. But Rachel's hands had put a curtain up, so that she was screened from his eyes. Her disgraceful garments were removed, and some of Rachel's were in the room. Everything was in its place and order as he had always kept it. The little fire was newly trimmed, and the hearth was freshly swept. It appeared to him that he saw all this in Rachel's face, and looked at nothing besides. While looking at it, it was shut out from his view by the softened tears that filled his eyes, but not before he had seen how earnestly she looked at him, and how her own eyes were filled too. She turned again towards the bed, and satisfying herself that all was quiet there, spoke in a low, calm, cheerful voice.
"I am glad you have come at last, Stephen. You are very late."
"I have been walking up and down."
"I thought so. But 'tis too bad a night for that. The rain falls very heavy, and the wind has risen."
The wind? True, it was blowing hard. Hark to the thundering in the chimney and the surging noise! To have been out in such a wind and not to have known it was blowing!
"I have been here once before to-day, Stephen. Landlady came round for me at dinner-time. There was someone here that needed looking to, she said. And 'deed she was right. All wandering and lost, Stephen. Wounded too, and bruised."
He slowly moved to a chair and sat down, drooping his head before her.
"I came to do what little I could, Stephen. First, for that she worked with me when we were girls both, and for that you courted her and married her when I was her friend."
He laid his furrowed forehead on his hand, with a low groan.
"And next, for that I know your heart, and am right sure and certain that 'tis far too merciful to let her die, or even so much as suffer for want of aid. Thou knowest who said, 'Let him who is without sin amongst you cast the first stone at her.' There have been plenty to do that. Thou'rt not the man to cast the last stone, Stephen, when she is brought so low."
"Oh, Rachel, Rachel!"
"Thou hast been a cruel sufferer. Heaven reward thee,"
she said, in compassionate accents.
"I am thy poor friend with all my heart and mind."
The wounds of which she had spoken seemed to be about the neck of the self-made outcast. She dressed them now, still without showing her. She steeped a piece of linen in a basin, into which she poured some liquid from a bottle, and laid it with a gentle hand upon the sore. The three-legged table had been drawn close to the bedside, and on it there were two bottles. This was one. It was not so far off but that Stephen, following her hands with his eyes, could read what was printed on it in large letters. He turned of a deadly hue, and a sudden horror seemed to fall upon him.
"I will stay here, Stephen,"
said Rachel, quietly resuming her seat,
"till the bells go 3. 'Tis to be done again at 3, and then she may be left till morning."
But thy rest again. Tomorrow's work, my dear.
"I slept sound last night. I can wake many nights when I am put to it. 'Tis thou who art in need of rest, so white and tired. Try to sleep in the chair there while I watch. Thou hadst no sleep last night, I can well believe. Tomorrow's work is far harder for thee than for me."
He heard the thundering and surging out of doors, and it seemed to him as if his late angry mood were going about trying to get at him. She had cast it out, she would keep it out. He trusted to her to defend him from himself.
"She don't know me, Stephen. She just drowsily mutters and stares. I have spoken to her times and again, but she don't notice. 'Tis as well so. When she comes to her right mind once more, I shall have done what I can, and she never the wiser."
How long, Rachel, this look for, that she'll be so?
Doctors said she would haply come to her mind tomorrow.
His eyes fell again on the bottle, and a tremble passed over him, causing him to shiver in every limb. She thought he was chilled with the wet.
"No,"
he said.
"it were not that. He'd had a fright."
"A fright?"
Aye, coming in, when I were walking, when I were thinking, when I—"
It seized him again, and he stood up, holding by the mantel-shelf, as he pressed his dank, cold hair down with a hand that shook as if it were palsied.
"Stephen!"
She was coming to him, but he stretched out his arm to stop her.
"No, don't, please don't. Let me see thee setting by bed. Let me see thee as so good and so forgiving. Let me see thee as I see thee when I coming in. I can never see thee better than so. Never, never, never."
He had a violent fit of trembling, and then sunk into his chair. After a time he controlled himself, and resting, with an elbow on one knee and his head upon that hand, could look towards Rachel. Seen across the dim candle, with his moistened eyes, she looked as if she had a glory shining round her head. He could have believed she had. He did believe it, as the noise without shook the window, rattled at the door below, and went about the house clamouring and lamenting.
"When she gets better, Stephen, 'tis to be hoped she'll leave thee to thyself again, and do thee no more hurt. Anyways, we will hope so now. And now I shall keep silence, for I want thee to sleep."
He closed his eyes, more to please her than to rest his weary head. But by slow degrees, as he listened to the great noise of the wind, he ceased to hear it, or it changed into the working of his loom, or even into the voices of the day, his own included, saying what had been really said. Even this imperfect consciousness faded away at last, and he dreamed a long, troubled dream. He thought that he and some one on whom his heart had long been set, but she was not Rachel, and that surprised him, even in the midst of his imaginary happiness, stood in the church being married. While the ceremony was performing, and while he recognized among the witnesses some whom he knew to be living, and many whom he knew to be dead, darkness came on, succeeded by the shining of a tremendous light. It broke from one line in the table of commandments at the altar, and illuminated the building with the words. They were sounded through the church, too, as if there were voices in the fiery letters. Upon this the whole appearance before him and around him changed, and nothing was left as it had been but himself and the clergyman. They stood in the daylight, before a crowd so vast that if all the people in the world could have been brought together into one space, they could not have looked, he thought, more numerous, and they all abhorred him, and there was not one pitying or friendly eye among the millions that were fastened on his face. He stood on a raised stage, under his own loom, and looking up at the shape the loom took, and hearing the burial service distinctly read, he knew that he was there to suffer death. In an instant what he stood on fell below him, and he was gone. Out of what mystery he came back to his usual life, and to places that he knew, he was unable to consider. But he was back in those places by some means, and with this condemnation upon him, that he was never, in this world or the next, through all the unimaginable ages of eternity, to look on Rachel's face or hear her voice. Wandering to and fro unceasingly, without hope, and in search of he knew not what, he only knew that he was doomed to seek it, he was the subject of a nameless, horrible dread, a mortal fear of one particular shape which everything took. Whatsoever he looked at grew into that form sooner or later. The object of his miserable existence was to prevent its recognition by any one among the various people he encountered. Hopeless labour! If he led them out of rooms where it was, if he shut up drawers and closets where it stood, if he drew the curious from places where he knew it to be secreted, and got them out into the streets, the very chimneys of the mills assumed that shape, and round them was the printed word. The wind was blowing again, the rain was beating on the housetops, and the larger spaces through which he had strayed contracted to the four walls of his room. Saving that the fire had died out, it was as his eyes had closed upon it. Rachel seemed to have fallen into a doze in the chair by the bed. She sat wrapped in her shawl, perfectly still. The table stood in the same place, close by the bedside, and on it, in its real proportions and appearance, was the shape so often repeated. He thought he saw the curtain move. He looked again, and he was sure it moved. He saw a hand come forth and grope about a little. Then the curtain moved more perceptibly, and the woman in the bed put it back and sat up. With her woeful eyes, so haggard and wild, so heavy and large, she looked all round the room, and past the corner where he slept in his chair. Her eyes returned to that corner, and she put her hand over them as a shade, while she looked into it. Again they went all round the room, scarcely heeding Rachel, if at all, and returned to that corner. He thought, as she once more shaded them, not so much looking at him as looking for him, with a brutish instinct that he was there, that no single trace was left in those debauched features, or in the mind that went along with them, of the woman he had married 18 years before. But that he had seen her come to this by inches, he never could have believed her to be the same. All this time, as if a spell were on him, he was motionless and powerless, except to watch her. Stupidly dozing, or communing with her incapable self about nothing, she sat for a little while with her hands at her ears, and her head resting on them. Presently she resumed her staring round the room, and now, for the first time, her eyes stopped at the table with the bottles on it. Straightway she turned her eyes back to his corner, with the defiance of last night, and moving very cautiously and softly, stretched out her greedy hand. She drew a mug into the bed, and sat for a while considering which of the two bottles she would choose. Finally she laid her insensate grasp upon the bottle that had swift and certain death in it, and before his eyes pulled out the cork with her teeth. Dream or reality, he had no voice, nor had he power to stir. If this be real, and her allotted time be not yet come, wake, Rachel, wake. She thought of that too. She looked at Rachel, and very slowly, very cautiously, poured out the contents. The draught was at her lips. A moment, and she would be past all help, let the whole world wake and come about her with its utmost power. But in that moment Rachel started up with a suppressed cry. The creature struggled, struck her, seized her by the hair, but Rachel had the cup. Stephen broke out of his chair.
Rachel, am I waking or dreaming this dreadful night?
'Tis all well, Stephen. I have been asleep myself. 'Tis near 3. Hush! I hear the bells.
The wind brought the sounds of the church clock to the window. They listened, and it struck 3. Stephen looked at her, saw how pale she was, noted the disorder of her hair and the red marks of fingers on her forehead, and felt assured that his senses of sight and hearing had been awake. She held the cup in her hand even now.
I thought it must be near 3,
she said, calmly pouring from the cup into the basin, and steeping the linen as before.
I am thankful I stayed. 'Tis done now, when I've put this on. There. And now she's quiet again. The few drops in the basin I'll pour away, for 'tis bad stuff to leave about, though ever so little of it.
As she spoke, she drained the basin into the ashes of the fire, broke the bottle on the hearth. She had nothing to do then but to cover herself with her shawl, before going out into the wind and rain.
They'll let me walk with thee at this hour, Rachel?
No, Stephen. 'Tis but a minute, and I'm home.
Thou art not fearful?
He said it in a low voice, as they went out at the door.
To leave me alone with you?
As she looked at him, saying,
Stephen.
He went down on his knee before her, on the poor mean stairs, and put an end of her shawl to his lips.
Thou art an angel, bless thee, bless thee.
I am, as I have told thee, Stephen, thy poor friend. Angels are not like me. Between them and a working woman full of faults there is a deep gulf set. My little sister is among them, but she is changed.
She raised her eyes for a moment as she said the words, and then they fell again, in all their gentleness and mildness, on his face.
Thou changest me from bad to good. Thou makest me humble, wish for to be more like thee, and fearful to lose thee when this life is o'er, and all t' muddle cleared away. Thou art an angel. It may be thou hast saved my soul alive.
She looked at him, on his knee at her feet, with her shawl still in his hand, and the reproof on her lips died away when she saw the working of his face.
I come home desperate, I come home without a hope, and mad with thinking that when I said a word of complaint I was reckoned an unreasonable hand. I told thee I'd had a fright. It were the poison bottle on table. I never hurt a living creature, but happening so sudden upon it, I thought, how can I say what I might have done to mysen, or her, or both?
She put her 2 hands on his mouth, with a face of terror, to stop him from saying more. He caught them in his unoccupied hand, and holding them, and still clasping the border of her shawl, said hurriedly,
But I see thee, Rachel, setting by the bed. I ha' seen thee all this night. In my troublous sleep I ha' known thee still be there. Evermore I'll see thee there. I never more will see her or think of her, but thou shalt be beside her. I never more will see or think of anything that angers me, but thou, so much better than me, shall be by the side on't, and so I'll try to look at time, and so I will try to trust at time, when thou and me at last shall walk together far away, beyond the deep gulfy country where thy little sister is.
He kissed the border of her shawl again, and let her go. She bade him good night in a broken voice, and went out into the street. The wind blew from the quarter where the day would soon appear, and still blew strongly. It had cleared the sky before it, and the rain had spent itself or travelled elsewhere, and the stars were bright. He stood bareheaded in the road, watching her quick disappearance. As the shining stars were to the heavy candle in the window, so was Rachel, in the rugged fancy of this man, to the common experiences of his life. End of chapter 13. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 14. The Great Manufacturer. Time went on in Coketown like its own machinery. So much material wrought up, so much fuel consumed, so many powers worn out, so much money made. But, less inexorable than iron, steel, and brass, it brought its varying seasons even into that wilderness of smoke and brick, and made the only stand that ever was made in the place against its direful uniformity.
"Louisa is becoming,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"almost a young woman."
Time, with his innumerable horse-power, worked away, not minding what anybody said, and presently turned out young Thomas a foot taller than when his father had last taken particular notice of him.
"Thomas is becoming,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"almost a young man."
Time passed Thomas on in the mill, while his father was thinking about it, and there he stood in a long-tailed coat and a stiff shirt-collar.
"Really,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"the period has arrived when Thomas ought to go to Bounderby."
Time, sticking to him, passed him on into Bounderby's bank, made him an inmate of Bounderby's house, necessitated the purchase of his first razor, and exercised him diligently in his calculations relative to number 1. The same great manufacturer, always with an immense variety of work on hand in every stage of development, passed Sissy onward in his mill, and worked her up into a very pretty article indeed.
"I fear, Jupe,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"that your continuance at the school any longer would be useless."
"I am afraid it would, sir,"
Sissy answered, with a curtsey.
"I cannot disguise from you, Jupe,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, knitting his brow,
"that the result of your probation there has disappointed me, has greatly disappointed me. You have not acquired under Mr. and Mrs. M'Choakumchild anything like that amount of exact knowledge which I looked for. You are extremely deficient in your facts. Your acquaintance with figures is very limited. You are altogether backward and below the mark."
"I am sorry, sir,"
she returned,
"but I know it is quite true. Yet I have tried hard, sir."
"Yes,"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"Yes, I believe you have tried hard. I have observed you, and I can find no fault in that respect."
"Thank you, sir. I have thought sometimes,"
Sissy very timid here,
"that perhaps I tried to learn too much, and that if I had asked to be allowed to try a little less, I might have—"
"No, Jupe, no,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, shaking his head in his profoundest and most eminently practical way.
"no. The course you pursued according to the system. The system, and there is no more to be said about it. I can only suppose that the circumstances of your early life were too unfavorable to the development of your reasoning powers, and that we began too late. Yet, as I have said already, I am disappointed."
"I wish I could have made a better acknowledgment, sir, of your kindness to a poor forlorn girl who had no claim upon you, and of your protection of her."
"Don't shed tears,"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"Don't shed tears. I don't complain of you. You are an affectionate, earnest, good young woman, and we must make that do."
"Thank you, sir, very much,"
said Sissy, with a grateful curtsey.
"You are very useful to Mrs. Gradgrind, and, in a generally pervading way, you are serviceable in the family also. So I understand from Miss Louisa, and indeed so I have observed myself. I therefore hope,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"that you can make yourself happy in those relations."
"I should have nothing to wish, sir, if—"
"I understand you,"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"You still refer to your father. I have heard from Miss Louisa that you still preserve that bottle. Well, if your training in the science of arriving at exact results had been more successful, you would have been wiser on these points. I will say no more.
He really liked Sissy too well to have a contempt for her. Otherwise he held her calculating powers in such very slight estimation that he must have fallen upon that conclusion. Somehow or other he had become possessed by an idea that there was something in this girl which could hardly be set forth in a tabular form. Her capacity of definition might be easily stated at a very low figure, her mathematical knowledge at nothing, yet he was not sure that if he had been required, for example, to tick her off into columns in a parliamentary return, he would have quite known how to divide her. In some stages of his manufacture of the human fabric, the processes of time were very rapid. Young Thomas and Sissy being both at such a stage of their working up, these changes were effected in a year or two, while Mr. Gradgrind himself seemed stationary in his course, and underwent no alteration. Except one, which was apart from his necessary progress through the mill. Time hustled him into a little noisy and rather dirty machinery, in a by-comer, and made him Member of Parliament for Coketown, one of the respected members for ounce weights and measures, one of the representatives of the multiplication table, one of the deaf honourable gentlemen, dumb honourable gentlemen, blind honourable gentlemen, lame honourable gentlemen, dead honourable gentlemen, to every other consideration. Else wherefore live we in a Christian land, 1800 and odd years after our Master? All this while Louisa had been passing on, so quiet and reserved, and so much given to watching the bright ashes at twilight as they fell into the grate and became extinct, that from the period when her father had said she was almost a young woman, which seemed but yesterday, she had scarcely attracted his notice again, when he found her quite a young woman.
Quite a young woman,
said Mr. Gradgrind, musing.
Dear me!
Soon after this discovery, he became more thoughtful than usual for several days, and seemed much engrossed by one subject. On a certain night, when he was going out, and Louisa came to bid him good-bye before his departure, as he was not to be home until late, and she would not see him again until the morning, he held her in his arms, looking at her in his kindest manner, and said,
My dear Louisa, you are a woman.
She answered with the old, quick, searching look of the night when she was found at the circus, then cast down her eyes.
Yes, father.
My dear,
said Mr. Gradgrind,
I must speak with you alone and seriously. Come to me in my room after breakfast to-morrow, will you?
Yes, father.
Your hands are rather cold, Louisa. Are you not well?
Quite well, father.
And cheerful?
She looked at him again, and smiled in her peculiar manner.
I am as cheerful, father, as I usually am or usually have been.
That's well,
said Mr. Gradgrind. So he kissed her and went away, and Louisa returned to the serene apartment of the hair-cutting character, and leaning her elbow on her hand, looked again at the short-lived sparks that so soon subsided into ashes.
Are you there, Lou?
said her brother, looking in at the door. He was quite a young gentleman of pleasure now, and not quite a prepossessing one.
Dear Tom,
she answered, rising and embracing him.
How long it is since you have been to see me.
Why, I've been otherwise engaged, Lou, in the evenings. In the daytime old Bounderby has been keeping me at it rather. But I touch him up with you when he comes at it too strong, and so we preserve an understanding. I say, has father said anything particular to you today or yesterday, Lou?
No, Tom, but he told me tonight that he wished to do so in the morning.
Ah, that's what I mean,
said Tom.
Do you know where he is tonight?
With a very deep expression.
No.
Then I'll tell you. He's with old Bounderby. They are having a regular confab together up at the bank. Why at the bank, do you think? Well, I'll tell you again. To keep Mrs. Sparsit's ears as far off as possible, I expect."
With her hand upon her brother's shoulder, Louisa still stood looking at the fire. Her brother glanced at her face with a greater interest than usual, and encircling her waist with his arm, drew her coaxingly to him.
"You are very fond of me, ain't you, Lou?"
"Indeed I am, Tom, though you do let such long intervals go by without coming to see me."
"Well, sister of mine, when you say that, you are near my thoughts. We might be so much oftener together, mightn't we? Always together almost, mightn't we? It would do me a great deal of good if you were to make up your mind to I know what, Lou. It would be a splendid thing for me. It would be uncommonly jolly."
Her thoughtfulness baffled his cunning scrutiny. He could make nothing of her face. He pressed her in his arm and kissed her cheek. She returned the kiss, but still looked at the fire.
"I say, Lou, I thought I'd come and just hint to you what was going on, though I suppose you'd most likely guess, even if you didn't know. I can't stay because I'm engaged to some fellows tonight. You won't forget how fond you are of me?"
"No, dear Tom, I won't forget."
"That's a capital girl,"
said Tom.
"Goodbye, Lou."
She gave him an affectionate good night, and went out with him to the door, whence the fires of Coketown could be seen, making the distance lurid. She stood there, looking steadfastly towards them, and listening to his departing steps. They retreated quickly, as glad to get away from Stone Lodge, and she stood there yet, when he was gone and all was quiet. It seemed as if, first in her own fire within the house, and then in the fiery haze without, she tried to discover what kind of woof old Time, that greatest and longest established spinner of all, would weave from the threads he had already spun into a woman. But his factory is a secret place, his work is noiseless, and his hands are mutes. End of chapter 14. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 15. Father and Daughter. Although Mr. Gradgrind did not take after Blue Beard, his room was quite a blue chamber in its abundance of blue books. Whatever they could prove, which is usually anything you like, they proved there, in an army constantly strengthening by the arrival of new recruits. In that charmed apartment the most complicated social questions were cast up, got into exact totals, and finally settled, if those concerned could only have been brought to know it. As if an astronomical observatory should be made without any windows, and the astronomer within should arrange the starry universe solely by pen, ink, and paper, so Mr. Gradgrind, in his observatory, and there are many like it, had no need to cast an eye upon the teeming myriads of human beings around him, but could settle all their destinies on a slate, and wipe out all their tears with one dirty little bit of sponge. To this observatory, then, a stern room with a deadly statistical clock in it, which measured every second with a beat like a rap upon a coffin-lid, Louisa repaired on the appointed morning. A window looked towards Coketown, and when she sat down near her father's table, she saw the high chimneys and the long tracts of smoke looming in the heavy distance gloomily.
"My dear Louisa,"
said her father,
"I prepared you last night to give me your serious attention in the conversation we are now going to have together. You have been so well trained, and you do, I am happy to say, so much justice to the education you have received, that I have perfect confidence in your good sense. You are not impulsive, you are not romantic, you are accustomed to view everything from the strong, dispassionate ground of reason and calculation. From that ground alone I know you will view and consider what I am going to communicate.
He waited, as if he would have been glad that she said something. But she said never a word.
Louisa, my dear, you are the subject of a proposal of marriage that has been made to me.
Again he waited, and again she answered not one word. This so far surprised him as to induce him gently to repeat,
A proposal of marriage, my dear.
To which she returned, without any visible emotion whatever,
I hear you, father. I am attending, I assure you.
Well,
said Mr. Gradgrind, breaking into a smile, after being for a moment at a loss.
You are even more dispassionate than I expected, Louisa. Or perhaps you are not unprepared for the announcement I have it in charge to make.
I cannot say that, father, until I hear it. Prepared or unprepared, I wish to hear it all from you. I wish to hear you state it to me, father.
Strange to relate, Mr. Gradgrind was not so collected at this moment as his daughter was. He took a paper knife in his hand, turned it over, laid it down, took it up again, and even then had to look along the blade of it, considering how to go on.
What you say, my dear Louisa, is perfectly reasonable. I have undertaken then to let you know that, in short, that Mr. Bounderby has informed me that he has long watched your progress with particular interest and pleasure, and has long hoped that the time might ultimately arrive when he should offer you his hand in marriage. That time to which he has so long and certainly with great constancy looked forward is now come. Mr. Bounderby has made his proposal of marriage to me, and has entreated me to make it known to you, and to express his hope that you will take it into your favourable consideration.
Silence between them. The deadly statistical clock very hollow, the distant smoke very black and heavy.
Father,
said Louisa,
do you think I love Mr. Bounderby?
Mr. Gradgrind was extremely discomfited by this unexpected question.
Well, my child, I really cannot take upon myself to say.
Father,
pursued Louisa, in exactly the same voice as before,
do you ask me to love Mr. Bounderby?
My dear Louisa, no, I ask nothing.
Father,
she still pursued,
does Mr. Bounderby ask me to love him?
Really, my dear,
said Mr. Gradgrind,
it is difficult to answer your question.
Difficult to answer it yes or no, father?
Certainly, my dear, because—
Here was something to demonstrate, and it set him up again.
Because the reply depends so materially, Louisa, on the sense in which we use the expression. Now, Mr. Bounderby does not do you the injustice, and does not do himself the injustice, of pretending to anything fanciful, fantastic, or, I am using synonymous terms, sentimental. Mr. Bounderby would have seen you grow up under his eyes to very little purpose, if we could go so far to forget what is due to your good sense, not to say to his, as to address you from any such ground. Therefore, perhaps the expression itself, I merely suggest this to you, my dear, may be a little misplaced.
What would you advise me to use in its stead, father?
My dear Louisa,
said Mr. Gradgrind, completely recovered by this time,
I would advise you, since you ask me, to consider this question as you have been accustomed to consider every other question, simply as one of tangible fact. The ignorant and giddy may embarrass such subjects with irrelevant fancies and other absurdities that have no existence properly viewed, really no existence, but it is no compliment to you to say that you know better. Now, what are the facts of this case? You are, we will say in round numbers, 20 years of age. Mr. Bounderby is, we will say, in round numbers, 50. Now, there is some disparity in your respective years, but in your means and positions there is none. On the contrary, there is a great suitability. Then the question arises, is this one disparity sufficient to operate as a bar to such a marriage? In considering this question, it is not unimportant to take into account the statistics of marriage so far as they have yet been obtained in England and Wales. I find on reference to the figures that a large proportion of these marriages are contracted between parties of very unequal ages, and that the elder of these contracting parties is, in rather more than 3/4 of these instances, the bridegroom. It is remarkable as showing the wide prevalence of this law that among the natives of the British possessions in India, also in a considerable part of China, and among the Kalmucks of Tartary, the best means of computation yet furnished by us travellers yield similar results. The disparity I have mentioned, therefore, almost ceases to be disparity, and virtually all but disappears.
What do you recommend, father?
asked Louisa, her reserved composure not in the least affected by these gratifying results.
That I should substitute for the term I used just now, for the misplaced expression.
Louisa,
returned her father,
it appears to me that nothing can be plainer. Confining yourself rigidly to fact, the question of fact you state to yourself is, does Mr. Bounderby ask me to marry him? Yes, he does. The sole remaining question then is, shall I marry him? I think nothing can be plainer than that.
Shall I marry him?
repeated Louisa, with great deliberation.
Precisely. And it is satisfactory to me, as your father, my dear Louisa, to know that you do not come to the consideration of that question with the previous habits of mind and habits of life that belong to many young women.
No, father,
she returned.
I do not.
I now leave you to judge for yourself,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
I have stated the case as such cases are usually stated among practical minds. I have stated it as the case of your mother and myself was stated in its time. The rest, my dear Louisa, is for you to decide.
From the beginning she had sat looking at him fixedly. As he now leaned back in his chair and bent his deep-set eyes upon her in his turn, perhaps he might have seen one wavering moment in her, when she was impelled to throw herself upon his breast and give him the pent-up confidences of her heart. But to see it, he must have overleaped at a bound the artificial barriers he had for many years been erecting between himself and all those subtle essences of humanity which will elude the utmost cunning of algebra, until the last trumpet ever to be sounded shall blow even algebra to wreck. The barriers were too many and too high for such a leap. With his unbending, utilitarian, matter-of-fact face, he hardened her again, and the moment shot away into the plumbless depths of the past, to mingle with all the lost opportunities that are drowned there. Removing her eyes from him, she sat so long looking silently towards the town, that he said at length,
Are you consulting the chimneys of the Coketown works, Louisa?
There seems to be nothing there but languid and monotonous smoke. Yet when the night comes, fire bursts out, father,
she answered, turning quickly.
Of course I know that, Louisa. I do not see the application of the remark.
To do him justice, he did not at all. She passed it away with a slight motion of her hand, and concentrating her attention upon him again, said,
Father, I have often thought that life is very short.
This was so distinctly one of his subjects that he interposed.
It is short, no doubt, my dear. Still, The average duration of human life is proved to have increased of late years. The calculations of various life assurance and annuity offices, among the other figures which cannot go wrong, have established the fact.
I speak of my own life, father.
Oh, indeed. Still,
said Mr. Gradgrind,
I need not point out to you, Louisa, that it is governed by the laws which govern lives in the aggregate.
While it lasts, I would wish to do the little I can and the little I am fit for. What does it matter?
Mr. Gradgrind seemed rather at a loss to understand the last 4 words, replying,
How matter? What matter, my dear?
Mr. Bounderby,
she went on in a steady, straight way, without regarding this,
asks me to marry him. The question I have to ask myself is, shall I marry him? That is so, father, is it not? You have told me so, father, have you not?
Certainly, my dear.
Let it be so. Since Mr. Bounderby likes to take me thus, I am satisfied to accept his proposal. Tell him, father, as soon as you please, that this was my answer. Repeat it, word for word, if you can, because I should wish him to know what I said.
It is quite right, my dear,
retorted her father approvingly.
To be exact, I will observe your very proper request. Have you any wish in reference to the period of your marriage, my child?
None, father. What does it matter?
Mr. Gradgrind had drawn his chair a little nearer to her, and taken her hand. But her repetition of these words seemed to strike with some little discord on his ear. He paused to look at her, and still holding her hand, said,
Louisa, I have not considered it essential to ask you one question, because the possibility implied in it appeared to me to be too remote. But perhaps I ought to do so. You have never entertained in secret any other proposal?
Father,
he returned, almost scornfully,
what other proposal can have been made to me? Whom have I seen? Where have I been? What are my heart's experiences?
My dear Louisa,
returned Mr. Gradgrind, reassured and satisfied,
you correct me justly. I merely wish to discharge my duty.
What do I know, father,
said Louisa in her quiet manner,
of tastes and fancies, of aspirations and affections, of all that part of my nature in which such light things might have been nourished? What escape have I had from problems that could be demonstrated, and realities that could be grasped?
As she said it, she unconsciously closed her hand, as if upon a solid object, and slowly opened it, as though she were releasing dust or ash.
My dear,
assented her eminently practical parent.
Quite true, quite true.
Why, father,
she pursued,
what a strange question to ask me! The baby preference that even I have heard of as common among children has never had its innocent resting place in my breast. You have been so careful of me that I never had a child's heart. You have trained me so well that I never dreamed a child's dream. You have dealt so wisely with me, father, from my cradle to this hour, that I never had a child's belief or a child's fear.
Mr. Gradgrind was quite moved by his success, and by this testimony to it.
My dear Louisa,
said he,
you abundantly repay my care. Kiss me, my dear girl.
So his daughter kissed him. Detaining her in his embrace, he said,
I may assure you now, my favourite child, that I am made happy by the sound decision at which you have arrived. Mr. Bounderby is a very remarkable man, and what little disparity can be said to exist between you, if any, is more than counterbalanced by the tone your mind has acquired. It has always been my object so to educate you as that you might, while still in your early youth, be, if I may so express myself, almost any age. Kiss me once more, Louisa. Now let us go find your mother.
Accordingly they went down to the drawing-room, where the esteemed lady, with no nonsense about her, was recumbent as usual, while Sissy worked beside her. She gave some feeble signs of returning animation when they entered, and presently the faint transparency was presented in a sitting attitude.
Mrs. Gradgrind,
said her husband, who had waited for the achievement of this feat with some impatience.
"Allow me to present to you Mrs. Bounderby."
"Oh,"
said Mrs. Gradgrind.
"so you have settled it. Well, I'm sure I hope your health may be good, Louisa, for if your head begins to split as soon as you are married, which was the case with mine, I cannot consider that you are to be envied, though I have no doubt you think you are, as all girls do. However, I give you joy, my dear, and I hope you may now turn all your ological studies to a good account. I am sure I do. I must give you a kiss of congratulation, Louisa, but don't touch my right shoulder, for there's something running down it all day long, and now you see,"
whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind, adjusting her shawls after the affectionate ceremony,
"I shall be worrying myself morning, noon, and night to know what I am to call him."
"Mrs. Gradgrind,"
said her husband solemnly.
"what do you mean?"
"Whatever am I to call him, Mr. Gradgrind, when he is married to Louisa? I must call him something. It's impossible,"
said Mrs. Gradgrind, with a mingled sense of politeness and injury,
"to be constantly addressing him and never giving him a name. I cannot call him Josiah, for the name is insupportable to me. You yourself wouldn't hear of Joe, as you very well know. Am I to call my own son-in-law Mister? Not, I believe, unless the time has arrived when as an invalid I am to be trampled upon by my relations. Then what am I to call him?"
Nobody present having any suggestion to offer in the remarkable emergency, Mrs. Gradgrind departed this life, for the time being, after delivering the following codicil to her remarks already executed.
"As to the wedding, all I ask, Louisa, is, and I ask it with a fluttering in my chest which actually extends to the soles of my feet, that it may take place soon. Otherwise I know it is one of those subjects I shall never hear the last of."
When Mr. Gradgrind had presented Mrs. Bounderby, Sissy had suddenly turned her head, and looked in wonder, in pity, in sorrow, in doubt, in a multitude of emotions, towards Louisa. Louisa had known it, and seen it, without looking at her. From that moment she was impassive, proud, and cold, held Sissy at a distance, changed to her altogether. End of chapter 15. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 16. Husband and Wife. Mr. Bounderby's first disquietude on hearing of his happiness was occasioned by the necessity of imparting it to Mrs. Sparsit. He could not make up his mind how to do it, or what the consequences of the step might be, whether she would instantly depart, bag and baggage, to Lady Scadger's, or would positively refuse to budge from the premises, whether she would be plaintive or abusive, tearful or tearing, whether she would break her heart or break the looking-glass, Mr. Bounderby could not all foresee. However, as it must be done, he had no choice but to do it. So, after attempting several letters, and failing in them all, he resolved to do it by word of mouth. On his way home, on the evening he set aside for this momentous purpose, he took the precaution of stepping into a chemist's shop, and buying a bottle of the very strongest smelling salts.
"Oh, by George,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"if she takes it in the fainting way, I'll have the skin off her nose at all events."
But, in spite of being thus forearmed, he entered his own house with anything but a courageous air, and appeared before the object of his misgivings like a dog who was conscious of coming direct from the pantry.
"Good evening, Mr. Bounderby."
"Good evening, ma'am. Good evening."
He drew up his chair, and Mrs. Sparsit drew back hers, as who should say,
"Your fireside, sir. I freely admit it. It is for you to occupy it all. if you think proper.
Don't go to the North Pole, ma'am,
said Mr. Bounderby.
Thank you, sir,
said Mrs. Sparsit, and returned, though short of her former position. Mr. Bounderby sat looking at her, as, with the points of a stiff, sharp pair of scissors, she picked out holes for some inscrutable ornamental purpose in a piece of cambric, an operation which, taken in connection with the bushy eyebrows and the Roman nose, suggested with some liveliness the idea of a hawk engaged upon the eyes of a tough little bird. She was so steadfastly occupied that many minutes elapsed before she looked up from her work. When she did so, Mr. Bounderby bespoke her attention with a hitch of his head.
"Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am,"
said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets, and assuring himself with his right hand that the cork of the little bottle was ready for use.
"I have no occasion to say to you that you are not only a lady born and bred, but a devilish sensible woman."
Sir,
returned the lady,
this is indeed not the first time that you have honoured me with similar expressions of your good opinion.
"Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"I am going to astonish you."
Yes, sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit interrogatively, and in the most tranquil manner possible. She generally wore mittens, and she now laid down her work and smoothed those mittens.
"I am going, ma'am,"
said Bounderby,
to marry Tom Gradgrind's daughter."
yes, sir.
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
I hope you may be happy, Mr. Bounderby. Oh, indeed, I hope you may be happy, sir.
And she said it with such great condescension, as well as with such great compassion for him, that Bounderby, far more disconcerted than if she had thrown her work-box at the mirror or swooned on the hearth-rug, corked up the smelling salts tight in his pocket, and thought,
"Oh, now confound the woman! Who could have even guessed she'd take it this way?"
I wish with all my heart, sir,
said Mrs. Sparsit, in a highly superior manner. Somehow she seemed in a moment to have established a right to pity him ever afterwards.
that you may in all respects be very happy.
"Well, ma'am,"
returned Bounderby, with some resentment in his tone, which was clearly lowered, though in spite of himself.
"I am obliged to you. I hope I shall be."
Do you, sir?
said Mrs. Sparsit, with great affability.
But naturally you do. Of course you do.
A very awkward pause on Mr. Bounderby's part succeeded. Mrs. Sparsit sedately resumed her work, and occasionally gave a small cough, which sounded like the cough of conscious strength and forbearance.
"Well, ma'am,"
resumed Bounderby,
"under these circumstances, I imagine it would not be agreeable to a character like yours to remain here, though you would be very welcome here."
Oh dear, no, sir. I could on no account think of that.
Mrs. Sparsit shook her head, still in her highly superior manner, and a little changed the small cough, coughing now as if the spirit of prophecy rose within her, but had better be coughed down.
"However, ma'am,"
said Bounderby,
"there are apartments at the bank, where a born-and-bred lady, as keeper of the place, would be rather a catch than otherwise, and if the same terms—"
I beg your pardon, sir. You were so good as to promise that you would always substitute the phrase annual compliment.
Well, ma'am, annual compliment. If the same annual compliment would be acceptable there, why, I see nothing to part us, unless you do."
Sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit,
the proposal is like yourself, and if the position I shall assume at the bank is one that I could occupy without descending lower in the social scale—
"Why, of course it is,"
said Bounderby.
"If it was not, ma'am, You don't suppose that I should offer it to a lady who has moved in the society you have moved in? Not that I care for such society, you know, but you do."
"Mr. Bounderby, you are very considerate."
"You'll have your own private apartments, and you'll have your coals and your candles, and all the rest of it, and you'll have your maid to attend upon you, and you'll have your light porter to protect you, and you'll be what I take the liberty of considering precious comfortable,"
said Bounderby.
"Sir,"
rejoined Mrs. Sparsit,
"say no more. In yielding up my trust here, I shall not be freed from the necessity of eating the bread of dependence."
She might have said the sweetbread, for that delicate article in a savoury brown sauce was her favourite supper.
"And I would rather receive it from your hand than from any other. Therefore, sir, I accept your offer gratefully, and with many sincere acknowledgments for past favours. And I hope, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, concluding in an impressively compassionate manner,
"I fondly hope that Miss Gradgrind may be all you desire and deserve."
Nothing moved Mrs. Sparsit from that position any more. It was in vain for Bounderby to bluster or assert himself in any of his explosive ways. Mrs. Sparsit was resolved to have compassion on him as a victim. She was polite, obliging, cheerful, hopeful. But the more polite, the more obliging, the more cheerful, the more hopeful, the more exemplary altogether she. The forlorner sacrifice and victim he. She had that tenderness for his melancholy fate, that his great red countenance used to break out into cold perspirations when she looked at him. Meanwhile the marriage was appointed to be solemnized in 8 weeks' time, and Mr. Bounderby went every evening to Stone Lodge as an accepted wooer. Love was made on these occasions in the form of bracelets, and on all occasions during the period of betrothal took a manufacturing aspect. Dresses were made, jewellery was made, cakes and gloves were made, settlements were made, and an extensive assortment of facts did appropriate honour to the contract. The business was all fact, from first to last. The hours did not go through any of those rosy performances which foolish poets have ascribed to them at such times. Neither did the clocks go any faster or any slower than at other seasons. The deadly statistical recorder in the Gradgrind Observatory knocked every second on the head as it was born, and buried it with his accustomed regularity. So the day came, as all other days come to people who will only stick to reason, and when it came they were married in the church of the florid wooden legs, that popular order of architecture. Joseph Bounderby, Esquire, of Coketown, to Louisa, eldest daughter of Thomas Gradgrind, Esquire, of Stone Lodge, M.P. for that borough. And when they were united in holy matrimony, they went home to breakfast at Stone Lodge aforesaid. There was an improving party assembled on the auspicious occasion, who knew what everything they had to eat and drink was made of, and how it was imported or exported, and in what quantities, and in what bottoms, whether native or foreign, and all about it. The bridesmaids, down to little Jane Gradgrind, were, in an intellectual point of view, fit helpmates for the calculating boy, and there was no nonsense about any of the company. After breakfast the bridegroom addressed them in the following terms:
"Ladies and gentlemen, I am Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Since you have done my wife and myself the honour of drinking our healths and happiness, I suppose I must acknowledge the same. Though, as you all know me, and know what I am, and what my extraction was, you won't expect a speech from a man who, when he sees a post, says, 'That's a post,' and when he sees a pump, says, That's a pump, and is not to be got to call a post a pump, or a pump a post, or either of them a toothpick. If you want a speech this morning, my friend and father-in-law, Tom Gradgrind, is a member of Parliament, and you know where to get it. I am not your man. However, if I feel a little independent when I look around this table to-day and reflect on how little I thought of marrying Tom Gradgrind's daughter when I was a ragged street boy who never washed his face unless it was at a pump, and that not oftener than once a fortnight, I hope I may be excused. So I hope you like my feeling independent. If you don't, I can't help it. I do feel independent. Now, I have mentioned, and you have mentioned, that I am this day married to Tom Gradgrind's daughter. I am very glad to be so. It has long been my wish to be so. I have watched her bringing up, and I believe she is worthy of me. At the same time, not to deceive you, I believe I am worthy of her. So I thank you on both our parts for the good will you have shown towards us, and the best wish I can give the unmarried part of the present company is this: I hope every bachelor may find as good wife as I have found, and I hope every spinster may find as good a husband as my wife has found.
Shortly after which oration, as they were going on a nuptial trip to Lyons, in order that Mr. Bounderby might take the opportunity of seeing how the hands got on in those parts, and whether they too required to be fed with gold spoons, the happy pair departed for the railroad. The bride, in passing downstairs, dressed for her journey, found Tom waiting for her, flushed, either with his feelings or the vinous part of the breakfast.
"What a game girl you are, to be such a first-rate sister, Lou,"
whispered Tom. She clung to him as she should have clung to some far better nature that day, and was a little shaken in her reserved composure for the first time.
"Old Bounderby's quite ready,"
said Tom.
"Time's up. Good-bye. I shall be on the lookout for you when you come back. I say, my dear Lou, ain't it uncommonly jolly now?"
End of chapter 16. End of Book 1 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 2, Reaping. Chapter 1, Effects in the Bank. A sunny midsummer day. There was such a thing sometimes, even in Coketown. Seen from a distance in such weather, Coketown lay shrouded in a haze of its own, which appeared impervious to the sun's rays. You only knew the town was there because you knew there could have been no such sulky blotch upon the prospect without a town. A blur of soot and smoke, now confusingly tending this way, now that way, now aspiring to the vault of heaven, now murkily creeping along the earth, as the wind rose and fell or changed its quarter. A dense formless jumble, with sheets of cross-light in it, that showed nothing but masses of darkness. Coketown in the distance was suggestive of itself, though not a brick of it could be seen. The wonder was it was there at all. It had been ruined so often that it was amazing how it had borne so many shocks. Surely there never was such a fragile china-ware as that of which the millers of Coketown were made. Handle them never so lightly, and they fell to pieces with such ease that you might suspect them of having been flawed before. They were ruined when they were required to send labouring children to school. They were ruined when inspectors were appointed to look into their works. They were ruined when such inspectors considered it doubtful whether they were quite justified in chopping people up with their machinery. They were utterly undone when it was hinted that perhaps they need not always make quite so much smoke. Besides Mr. Bounderby's gold spoon, which was generally received in Coketown, another prevalent fiction was very popular there. It took the form of a threat. Whenever a Coketowner felt he was ill-used, that is to say, whenever he was not left entirely alone, and it was proposed to hold him accountable for the consequences of any of his acts, he was sure to come out with the awful menace that he would "sooner pitch his property into the Atlantic." This had terrified the Home Secretary within an inch of his life on several occasions. However, the Coketowners were so patriotic after all, that they never had pitched their property into the Atlantic yet, but, on the contrary, had been kind enough to take mighty good care of it. So there it was, in the haze yonder, and it increased and multiplied. The streets were hot and dusty on the summer day, and the sun was so bright that it even shone through the heavy vapour drooping over Coketown, and could not be looked at steadily. Stokers emerged from low underground doorways into factory yards, and sat on steps and posts and palings, wiping their swarthy visages, and contemplating coals. The whole town seemed to be frying in oil. There was a stifling smell of hot oil everywhere. The steam engines shone with it. The dresses of the hands were soiled with it. The mills throughout their many stories oozed and trickled it. The atmosphere of those fairy palaces was like the breath of the simoom, and their inhabitants, wasting with heat, toiled languidly in the desert. But no temperature made the melancholy mad elephants more mad or more sane. Their wearisome heads went up and down at the same rate, in hot weather and cold, wet weather and dry, fair weather and foul. The measured motion of their shadows on the walls was the substitute Coketown had to show for the shadows of rustling woods, while for the summer hum of insects it could offer all year round, from the dawn of Monday to the night of Saturday, the whir of shafts and wheels. Drowsily they whirred all through this sunny day, making the passenger more sleepy and more hot as he passed the humming walls of the mills. Sun-blinds and sprinklings of water a little cooled the main streets and the shops, but the mills and the courts and alleys baked at a fierce heat. Down upon the river that was black and thick with dye, some Coketown boys who were at large, a rare sight there, rowed a crazy boat, which made a spumous attack upon the water as it jogged along, while every dip of an oar stirred up vile smells. But the sun itself, however beneficent, generally was less kind to Coketown than hard frost, and rarely looked intently into any of its closer regions without engendering more death than life. So does the eye of heaven itself become an evil eye, when incapable or sordid hands are interposed between it and the things it looks upon to bless. Mrs. Sparsit sat in her afternoon apartment at the bank, on the shadier side of the frying street. Office hours were over, and at that period of the day, in warm weather, she usually embellished, with her genteel presence, a managerial board-room over the public office. Her own private sitting-room was a story higher, at the window of which post of observation she was ready every morning to greet Mr. Bounderby as he came across the road, with the sympathizing recognition appropriate to a victim. He had been married now a year, and Mrs. Sparsit had never released him from her determined pity a moment. The bank offered no violence to the wholesome monotony of the town. It was another red-brick house, with black outside shutters, green inside blinds, a black street door up 2 white steps, a brazen door-plate, and a brazen door-handle, full stop. It was a size larger than Mr. Bounderby's house, as other houses were from a size to half a dozen sizes smaller. In all other particulars it was strictly according to pattern. Mrs. Sparsit was conscious that by coming in the evening-tide among the desks and writing implements, she shed a feminine, not to say also aristocratic, grace upon the office. Seated, with her needle-work or netting apparatus at the window, she had a self-laudatory sense of correcting, by her ladylike deportment, the rude business aspect of the place. With this impression of her interesting character upon her, Mrs. Sparsit considered herself, in some sort, the bank fairy. The townspeople, who in their passing and repassing saw her there, regarded her as the bank dragon, keeping watch over the treasures of the mine. What these treasures were, Mrs. Sparsit knew as little as they did. Gold and silver coin, precious paper, secrets that if divulged would bring vague destruction upon vague persons, generally, however, people whom she disliked, were the chief items in her ideal catalogue thereof. For the rest, she knew that after office hours she reigned supreme over all the office furniture, and over a locked-up iron room with 3 locks, against the door of which strong chamber the light-porter laid his head every night, on a truckle bed that disappeared at cock-crow. Further, she was lady paramount over certain vaults in the basement, sharply spiked off from communication with the predatory world, and over the relics of the current day's work, consisting of blots of ink, worn-out pens, fragments of wafers, and scraps of paper torn so small that nothing interesting could ever be deciphered on them when Mrs. Sparsit tried. Lastly, she was guardian over a little armoury of cutlasses and carbines, arrayed in vengeful order above one of the official chimney-pieces, and over that respectable tradition never to be separated from a place of business claiming to be wealthy, a row of fire-buckets, vessels calculated to be of no physical utility on any occasion, but observed to exercise a fine moral influence, almost equal to bullion, on most beholders. A deaf serving-woman and the light-porter completed Mrs. Sparsit's empire. The deaf serving-woman was rumoured to be wealthy, and a saying had for years gone about among the lower orders of Coketown, that she would be murdered some night when the bank was shut for the sake of her money. It was generally considered, indeed, that she had been due some time, and ought to have fallen long ago, but she had kept her life and her situation with an ill-conditioned tenacity that occasioned much offence and disappointment. Mrs. Sparsit's tea was just set for her on a pert little table, with its tripod of legs in an attitude, which she insinuated after office hours into the company of a stern, leathern-topped long-board table that bestrode the middle of the room. The light-porter placed the tea-tray on it, knuckling his forehead as a form of homage.
"Thank you, Bitzer,"
said Mrs. Sparsit.
"Thank you, ma'am,"
returned the light-porter. He was a very light porter indeed, as light as in the days when he blinkingly defined a horse for girl number 20.
"All is shut up, Bitzer?"
said Mrs. Sparsit.
"All is shut up, ma'am."
"And what,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, pouring out her tea,
"is the news of the day? Anything?"
"Well, ma'am, I can't say that I've heard anything particular. Our people are a bad lot, ma'am, but that is no news, unfortunately."
"What are the restless wretches doing now?"
asked Mrs. Sparsit.
"Merely going on in the old way, ma'am, uniting and leaguing and engaging to stand by one another."
"It is much to be regretted,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, making her nose more Roman and her eyebrows more Coriolanian in the strength of her severity,
"that the united masters allow of any such class combinations."
Yes, ma'am,
said Bitzer.
"Being united themselves, they ought one and all to set their faces against employing any man who is united with any other man,"
said Mrs. Sparsit.
They have done that, ma'am,
returned Bitzer.
But it rather fell through, ma'am.
"I do not pretend to understand these things,"
said Mrs. Sparsit with dignity.
"my lot having been signally cast in a widely different sphere, and Mr. Sparsit, as a Powler, being also quite out of the pale of any such dissensions. I only know that these people must be conquered, and that it's high time it was done, once for all."
Yes, ma'am,
returned Bitzer, with a demonstration of great respect for Mrs. Sparsit's oracular authority.
You couldn't put it clearer, I am sure, ma'am.
As this was his usual hour for having a little confidential chat with Mrs. Sparsit, and as he had already caught her eye and seen that she was going to ask him something, he made a pretence of arranging the rulers, inkstands, and so forth, while that lady went on with her tea, glancing through the open window down into the street.
"Has it been a busy day, Bitzer?" asked
Mrs. Sparsit.
Not a very busy day, my lady. About an average day.
He now and then slided into "my-lady" instead of "ma'am," as an involuntary acknowledgment of Mrs. Sparsit's personal dignity and claims to reverence.
"The clerks,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, carefully brushing an imperceptible crumb of bread and butter from her left-hand mitten,
"are trustworthy, punctual, and industrious, of course?"
Yes, ma'am, pretty fair, ma'am, with the usual exception.
He held the respectable office of general spy and informer in the establishment, for which volunteer service he received a present at Christmas, over and above his weekly wage. He had grown into an extremely clear-headed, cautious, prudent young man, who was safe to rise in the world. His mind was so exactly regulated that he had no affectations or passions. All his proceedings were the result of the nicest and coldest calculation, and it was not without cause that Mrs. Sparsit habitually observed of him that he was a young man of the steadiest principle she had ever known. Having satisfied himself, on his father's death, that his mother had a right of settlement in Coketown, this excellent young economist had asserted that right for her with such a steadfast adherence to the principle of the case, that she had been shut up in a workhouse ever since. It must be admitted that he allowed her £1/2 of tea a year, which was weak in him. First, because all gifts have an inevitable tendency to pauperize the recipient, and secondly, because his only reasonable transaction in that commodity would have been to buy it for as little as he could possibly give, and sell it for as much as he could possibly get, it having been clearly ascertained by philosophers that in this is comprised the whole duty of man, not a part of man's duty, but the whole.
Pretty fair, ma'am, with the usual exception, ma'am,
repeated Bitzer.
"Ah!"
said Mrs. Sparsit, shaking her head over her teacup, and taking a long gulp.
Mr. Thomas, ma'am. I doubt Mr. Thomas very much, ma'am. I don't like his ways at all.
"Bitzer,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, in a very impressive manner,
"do you recollect my having said anything to you respecting names?"
I beg your pardon, ma'am. It's quite true that you did object to names being used, and they're always best avoided.
"Please to remember that I have a charge here,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, with her air of state.
"I hold a trust here, Bitzer, under Mr. Bounderby. However improbable both Mr. Bounderby and myself might have deemed it years ago that he would ever become my patron, making me an annual compliment, I cannot but regard him in that light. From Mr. Bounderby I have received every acknowledgment of my social station, and every recognition of my family descent that I could possibly expect. More, far more. Therefore to my patron I will be scrupulously true, and I do not consider, I will not consider, I cannot consider,
said Mrs. Sparsit, with a most extensive stock on hand of honour and morality,
that I should be scrupulously true, if I allowed names to be mentioned under this roof, that are unfortunately, most unfortunately, no doubt of that, connected with his.
Bitzer knuckled his forehead again, and again begged pardon.
No, Bitzer,
continued Mrs. Sparsit.
Say an individual, and I will hear you. Say Mr. Thomas, and you must excuse me.
With the usual exception, ma'am,
said Bitzer, trying back,
of an individual.
Ah.
Mrs. Sparsit repeated the ejaculation, the shake of the head over her teacup, and the long gulp, as taking up the conversation again at that point where it had been interrupted.
An individual, ma'am,
said Bitzer,
has never been what he ought to have been since he first came into the place. He is a dissipated, extravagant idler. He is not worth his salt, ma'am. He wouldn't get it either if he hadn't a friend and relation at court, ma'am.
Ah,
said Mrs. Sparsit, with another melancholy shake of her head.
I only hope, ma'am,
pursued Bitzer,
that his friend and relation may not supply him with the means of carrying on. Otherwise, ma'am, we know out of whose pocket that money comes.
ah,
sighed Mrs. Sparsit again, with another melancholy shake of her head.
He is to be pitied, ma'am. The last party I have alluded to is to be pitied, ma'am,
said Bitzer.
yes, Bitzer,
said Mrs. Sparsit.
I have always pitied the delusion, always.
As to an individual, ma'am,
said Bitzer, dropping his voice and drawing nearer,
he is as improvident as any of the people in this town. And you know what their improvidence is, ma'am. No one could wish to know it better than a lady of your eminence does.
They would do well,
returned Mrs. Sparsit,
to take example by you, Bitzer.
Thank you, ma'am. But since you do refer to me, now look at me, ma'am. I have put by a little, ma'am, already. That gratuity which I receive at Christmas, ma'am, I never touch it. I don't even go to the length of my wages, though they're not I, ma'am. Why can't they do as I have done, ma'am? What one person can do, another can do.
This again was among the fictions of Coketown. Any capitalist there, who made £60,000 out of sixpence, always professed to wonder why the 60,000 nearest hands didn't each make £60,000 out of sixpence, and more or less reproached them every one for not accomplishing the little feat. What I did you can do. Why don't you go and do it?
As to their wanting recreations, ma'am,
said Bitzer,
it's stuff and nonsense. I don't want recreations. I never did, and I never shall. I don't like 'em. As to their combining together, there are many of them, I have no doubt, that by watching and informing upon one another, could earn a trifle now and then, whether in money or goodwill, and improve their livelihood. Then why don't they improve it, ma'am? It's the first consideration of a rational creature, and it's what they pretend to want.
Pretend, indeed,
said Mrs. Sparsit.
I am sure we are constantly hearing, ma'am, till it becomes quite nauseous concerning their wives and families,
said Bitzer.
Why, look at me, ma'am, I don't want a wife and family. Why should they?
because they are improvident,
said Mrs. Sparsit.
Yes, ma'am,
returned Bitzer.
That's where it is. If they were more provident and less perverse, ma'am, what would they do? They would say, while my hat covers my family, or while my bonnet covers my family, as the case might be, ma'am. I've only one to feed, and that's the person I most like to feed.
to be sure,
assented Mrs. Sparsit, eating muffin.
Thank you, ma'am,
said Bitzer, knuckling his forehead again in return for the favour of Mrs. Sparsit's improving conversation.
Would you wish a little more hot water, ma'am, or is there anything else that I could fetch you?
Nothing just now, Bitzer.
Thank you, ma'am. I shouldn't wish to disturb you at your meals, ma'am, particularly tea, knowing your partiality for it,"
said Bitzer, craning a little to look over into the street from where he stood.
"but there's been a gentleman been looking up here for a minute or so, ma'am, and he has come across as if he was going to knock. That is his knock, ma'am, no doubt."
He stepped to the window, and looking out, and drawing in his head again, confirmed himself with,
"Yes, ma'am. Would you wish the gentleman to be shown in, ma'am?"
I don't know who it can be,
said Mrs. Sparsit, wiping her mouth and arranging her mitten.
"A stranger, ma'am, evidently."
What can a stranger want at the bank this time of evening, unless he comes upon some business for which he is too late, I don't know,
said Mrs. Sparsit.
But I hold a charge in this establishment from Mr. Bounderby, and I will never shrink from it. If to see him is any part of the duty I have accepted, I will see him. Use your own discretion, Bitzer."
Here the visitor, all unconscious of Mrs. Sparsit's magnanimous words, repeated his knock so loudly that the light porter hastened down to open the door, while Mrs. Sparsit took the precaution of concealing her little table, with all its appliances upon it, in a cupboard, and then decamped upstairs, that she might appear, if needful, with the greater dignity.
"If you please, ma'am, the gentleman would wish to see you,"
said Bitzer, with his light eye at Mrs. Sparsit's keyhole. So Mrs. Sparsit, who had improved the interval by touching up her cap, took her classical features downstairs again, and entered the board-room in the manner of a Roman matron going outside the city walls to treat with an invading general. The visitor, having strolled to the window, and being then engaged in looking carelessly out, was as unmoved by this impressive entry as man could possibly be. He stood whistling to himself with all imaginable coolness, with his hat still on, and a certain air of exhaustion upon him, in part arising from excessive summer, and in part from excessive gentility. For it was to be seen with half an eye that he was a thorough gentleman, made to the model of the time, weary of everything, and putting no more faith in anything than Lucifer.
"I believe, sir,"
quoth Mrs. Sparsit,
"you wished to see me."
"I beg your pardon,"
he said, turning and removing his hat.
"Pray excuse me."
"Humph!"
thought Mrs. Sparsit, as she made a stately bend.
35, good-looking, good figure, good teeth, good voice, good breeding, well-dressed, dark hair, bold eyes."
All which Mrs. Sparsit observed in her womanly way, like the Sultan who put his head in the pail of water, merely in dipping down and coming up again.
"Please to be seated, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit.
"Thank you. Allow me."
He placed a chair for her, but remained himself carelessly lounging against the table.
"I left my servant at the railway looking after the luggage. Very heavy train and vast quantity of it in the van, and strolled on, looking about me. Exceedingly odd place. Will you allow me to ask if it's always as black as this?"
"In general, much blacker,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit, in her uncompromising way.
"Is it possible? Excuse me, you are not a native, I think?"
"No, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
"It was once my good, or ill fortune, as it may be, before I became a widow, to move in a very different sphere. My husband was a Powler."
"Beg your pardon, really?"
said the stranger.
"Was—"
Mrs. Sparsit repeated.
"A Powler."
"Powler family,"
said the stranger, after reflecting a few moments. Mrs. Sparsit signified assent. The stranger seemed a little more fatigued than before.
"You must be very much bored here?"
was the inference he drew from the communication.
"I am the servant of circumstances, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit.
"and I have long adapted myself to the governing power of my life."
"Very philosophical,"
returned the stranger.
"and very exemplary and laudable, and—"
It seemed to be scarcely worth his while to finish the sentence, so he played with his watch-chain wearily.
May I be permitted to ask, sir,
said Mrs. Sparsit,
to what I am indebted for the favour of—
Assuredly,
said the stranger.
Much obliged to you for reminding me. I am the bearer of a letter of introduction to Mr. Bounderby the banker. Walking through this extraordinarily black town, while we were getting dinner ready at the hotel, I asked a fellow whom I met, one of the working people who seemed to have been taking a shower bath of something fluffy, which I assumed to be the raw material.
Mrs. Sparsit inclined her head.
Raw material, where Mr. Bounderby the banker might reside. Upon which, misled no doubt by the word banker, he directed me to the bank. Fact being, I presume that Mr. Bounderby the banker does not reside in the edifice to which I have the honour of offering his explanation?
No, sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
he does not.
Thank you. I had no intention of delivering my letter at the present moment, nor have I, but strolling on to the bank to kill time, and having the good fortune to observe at the window,
towards which he languidly waved his hand, then slightly bowed,
a lady of a very superior and agreeable appearance, I considered that I could not do better than take the liberty of asking that lady where Mr. Bounderby the banker does live, which I accordingly venture, with all suitable apologies, to do.
The inattention and indolence of his manner were sufficiently relieved, to Mrs. Sparsit's thinking, by a certain gallantry at ease, which offered her homage too. Here he was, for instance, at this moment, all but sitting on the table, and yet lazily bending over her, as if he acknowledged an attraction in her that made her charming, in her way.
Banks, I know, are always suspicious, and officially must be,
said the stranger, whose lightness and smoothness of speech were pleasant likewise, suggesting matter far more sensible and humorous than it ever contained, which was perhaps a shrewd device of the founder of his numerous sect, whosoever may have been that great man.
Therefore I may observe that my letter, here it is from the member for this place, Gradgrind, whom I have had the pleasure of knowing in London.
Mrs. Sparsit recognized the hand, intimated that such confirmation was quite unnecessary, and gave Mr. Bounderby's address, with all needful clues and directions in aid.
"Thousand thanks,"
said the stranger.
"Of course you know the banker well?"
Yes, sir,
rejoined Mrs. Sparsit.
In my dependent relation towards him, I have known him 10 years.
Quite an eternity. I think he married Gradgrind's daughter?
Yes,
said Mrs. Sparsit, suddenly compressing her mouth.
He had that honour.
The lady is quite a philosopher, I am told.
Indeed, sir?
said Mrs. Sparsit.
Is she?
Excuse my impertinent curiosity,
pursued the stranger, fluttering over Mrs. Sparsit's eyebrows with a propitiatory air.
But you know the family, and know the world. I am about to know the family, and may have much to do with them. Is the lady so very alarming? Her father gives her such a portentously hard-headed reputation that I have a burning desire to know. Is she absolutely unapproachable? Repellently and stunningly clever? I see, by your meaning smile, you think not. You will pour balm into my anxious soul. As to age now, 40? 35?
Mrs. Sparsit laughed outright.
Ha! A chit,
said she.
Not 20 when she was married.
I give you my honour, Mrs. Powler,
returned the stranger, detaching himself from the table,
that I never was so astonished in my life.
It really did seem to impress him, to the utmost extent of his capacity of being impressed. He looked at his informant for full a quarter of a minute, and appeared to have the surprise in his mind all the time.
I assure you, Mrs. Powler,
he then said, much exhausted,
that the father's manner prepared me for a grim and stony maturity. I am obliged to you, of all things, for correcting so absurd a mistake. Pray excuse my intrusion. Many thanks. Good day.
He bowed himself out, and Mrs. Sparsit, hiding in the window-curtain, saw him languishing down the street on the shady side of the way, observed of all the town.
What do you think of the gentleman, Bitzer?
She asked the light porter, when he came to take away.
Spends a deal of money on his dress, ma'am.
It must be admitted,
said Mrs. Sparsit.
that it's very tasteful.
Yes, ma'am,
returned Bitzer.
if that's worth the money. Besides which, ma'am,
resumed Bitzer, while he was polishing the table,
it looks to me as if he gamed.
It's immoral to game,
said Mrs. Sparsit.
It's ridiculous, ma'am,
said Bitzer.
because the chances are against the players.
Whether it was the heat that prevented Mrs. Sparsit from working, or whether it was that her hand was out, she did no work that night. She sat at the window when the sun began to sink behind the smoke. She sat there when the smoke was burning red, when the colour faded from it, when darkness seemed to rise slowly out of the ground and creep upward, up to the housetops, up to the church steeple, up to the summits of the factory chimneys, up to the sky. Without a candle in the room, Mrs. Sparsit sat at the window with her hands before her, not thinking much of the sounds of evening, the whooping of boys, the barking of dogs, the rumbling of wheels, the steps and voices of passengers, the shrill street cries, the clogs upon the pavement when it was their hour for going by, the shutting up of shop-shutters. Not until the light porter announced that her nocturnal sweetbread was ready did Mrs. Sparsit arouse herself from her reverie, and convey her dense black eyebrows, by that time creased with meditation, as if they needed ironing out, upstairs.
"Oh, you fool!"
said Mrs. Sparsit, when she was alone at her supper. Whom she meant she did not say, but she could scarcely have meant the sweetbread. End of chapter 1. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 2. Mr. James Harthouse. The Gradgrind party wanted assistance in cutting the throats of the Graces. They went about recruiting, and where could they enlist recruits more hopefully than among the fine gentlemen who, having found out everything to be worth nothing, were equally ready for anything? Moreover, the healthy spirits who had mounted to this sublime height were attractive to many of the Gradgrind school. They liked fine gentlemen. They pretended that they did not, but they did. They became exhausted in imitation of them, and they yaw-yawed in their speech like them, and they served out, with an enervated air, the little mouldy rations of political economy on which they regaled their disciples. There never before was seen on earth such a wonderful hybrid race as was thus produced. Among the fine gentlemen not regularly belonging to the Gradgrind school, there was one of a good family and a better appearance, with a happy turn of humour which had told immensely with the House of Commons on the occasion of his entertaining it with his and the Board of Directors' view of a railway accident, in which the most careful officers ever known, employed by the most liberal managers ever heard of, assisted by the finest mechanical contrivances ever devised, the whole in action on the best line ever constructed, had killed 5 people and wounded 32, by a casualty without which the excellence of the whole system would have been positively incomplete. Among the slain was a cow, and among the scattered articles unowned, a widow's cap. And the honourable member had so tickled the House, which has a delicate sense of humour, by putting the cap on the cow, that it became impatient of any serious reference to the coroner's inquest, and brought the railway off with cheers and laughter. Now this gentleman had a younger brother of still better appearance than himself, who had tried life as a cornet of dragoons, and found it a bore, and had afterwards tried it in the train of an English minister abroad, and found it a bore, and had then strolled to Jerusalem, and got bored there, and had then gone yachting about the world, and got bored everywhere. To whom this honourable and jocular member fraternally said one day,
"Jem, there's a good opening among the hard fact fellows, and they want men. I wonder you don't go in for statistics."
Jem, rather taken by the novelty of the idea, and very hard up for a change, was as ready to go in for statistics as for anything else. So he went in. He coached himself up with a blue book or two, and his brother put it about among the hard fact fellows, and said,
"If you want to bring in, for any place, a handsome dog who can make you a devilish good speech, look after my brother Jem, for he's your man."
After a few dashes in the public meeting way, Mr. Gradgrind and a council of political sages approved of Jem, and it was resolved to send him down to Coketown to become known there and in the neighbourhood. Hence the letter Jem had last night shown to Mrs. Sparsit, which Mr. Bounderby now held in his hand, circumscribed,
Josiah Bounderby, Esquire, Banker, Coketown. Specially to introduce James Harthouse, Esquire, Thomas Gradgrind.
Within an hour of the receipt of this despatch and Mr. James Harthouse's card, Mr. Bounderby put on his hat and went down to the hotel. There he found Mr. James Harthouse looking out of a window, in a state of mind so disconsolate that he was already half disposed to go in for something else.
"My name, sir,"
said his visitor,
"is Josiah Bounderby of Coketown."
Mr. James Harthouse was very happy indeed, though he scarcely looked so, to have a pleasure he had long expected.
"Coketown, sir,"
said Bounderby, obstinately taking a chair,
"is not the kind of place you have been accustomed to. Therefore, if you will allow me, or whether you will or not, for I am a plain man, I'll tell you something about it before we go any further."
Mr. Harthouse would be charmed.
"Don't be too sure of that,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"I don't promise it. First of all, you see our smoke. That's meat and drink to us. It's the healthiest thing in the world in all respects, and particularly for the lungs. If you're one of those who want us to consume it, I differ from you. We're not going to wear the bottoms of our boilers out any faster than we wear 'em out now, for all humbugging sentiment in Great Britain and Ireland."
By way of going in to the fullest extent, Mr. Harthouse rejoined,
"Mr. Bounderby, I assure you I am entirely and completely of your way of thinking, on conviction."
"I'm glad to hear it,"
said Bounderby.
"Now, you have heard a lot of talk about the work in our mills, no doubt. You have? Very good. I'll state the facts of it to you. It's the pleasantest work there is, and it's the lightest work there is, and it's the best paid work there is. More than that, we couldn't improve the mills themselves unless we laid down Turkey carpets on the floors, which we're not a-going to do."
"Mr. Bounderby, perfectly right."
"Lastly,"
said Bounderby,
"as to our hands. There's not a hand in this town, sir, man, woman, or child, but has one ultimate object in life. That object is to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon. Now they're not a-going, none of them, ever to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon. Now you know the place."
Mr. Harthouse professed himself in the highest degree instructed and refreshed by this condensed epitome of the whole Coketown question.
"Why, you see,"
replied Mr. Bounderby,
It suits my disposition to have a full understanding with a man, particularly with a public man, when I make his acquaintance. I have only one thing more to say to you, Mr. Harthouse, before assuring you of the pleasure with which I shall respond, to the utmost of my poor ability, to my friend Tom Gradgrind's letter of introduction. You are a man of family. Don't you deceive yourself by supposing for a moment that I am a man of family. I am a bit of dirty riff-raff, and a genuine scrap of rag, tag, and bobtail.
If anything could have exalted Jem's interest in Mr. Bounderby, it would have been this very circumstance. Or so he told him.
So now,
said Bounderby,
we may shake hands on equal terms. I say equal terms, because although I know what I am, and the exact depth of the gutter I have lifted myself out of better than any man does, I am as proud as you are. I am just as proud as you are. Having now asserted my independence in a proper manner, I may come to how do you find yourself, and I hope you're pretty well.
The better, Mr. Harthouse gave him to understand as they shook hands, for the salubrious air of Coketown. Mr. Bounderby received the answer with favour.
Perhaps you know,
said he.
Oh, perhaps you don't know. I married Tom Gradgrind's daughter. If you have nothing better to do than to walk uptown with me, I shall be glad to introduce you to Tom Gradgrind's daughter.
Mr. Bounderby,
said Jem,
you anticipate my dearest wishes.
They went out without further discourse, and Mr. Bounderby piloted the new acquaintance, who so strongly contrasted with him, to the private red-brick dwelling, with the black outside shutters, the green inside blinds, and the black street door up the 2 white steps. In the drawing-room of which mansion there presently entered to them the most remarkable girl Mr. James Harthouse had ever seen. She was so constrained, and yet so careless, so reserved, and yet so watchful, so cold and proud, and yet so sensitively ashamed of her husband's braggart humility, from which she shrunk as if every example of it were a cut or a blow, that it was quite a new sensation to observe her. In face she was no less remarkable than in manner. Her features were handsome, but their natural play was so locked up that it seemed impossible to guess at their genuine expression. Utterly indifferent, perfectly self-reliant, never at a loss, and yet never at her ease, with her figure in company with them there, and her mind apparently quite alone. It was of no use going in yet a while to comprehend this girl, for she baffled all penetration. From the mistress of the house the visitor glanced to the house itself. There was no mute sign of a woman in the room. No graceful little adornment, no fanciful little device, however trivial, anywhere expressed her influence. Cheerless and comfortless, boastfully and doggedly rich, there the room stared at its present occupants, unsoftened and unrelieved by the least trace of any womanly occupation. As Mr. Bounderby stood in the midst of his household goods, so those unrelenting divinities occupied their places around Mr. Bounderby, and they were worthy of one another, and well matched.
This, sir,
said Bounderby,
is my wife, Mrs. Bounderby, Tom Gradgrind's eldest daughter. Lou, Mr. James Harthouse. Mr. Harthouse has joined your father's muster roll. If he is not Tom Gradgrind's colleague before long, I believe we shall at least hear of him in connection with one of our neighbouring towns. You observe, Mr. Harthouse, that my wife is my junior. I don't know what she saw in me to marry me, but she saw something in me, I suppose, or she wouldn't have married me. She has lots of expensive knowledge, sir, political and otherwise. If you want to cram for anything, I should be troubled to recommend you to a better adviser than Lou Bounderby.
To a more agreeable adviser, or one from whom he would be more likely to learn, Mr. Harthouse could never be recommended.
"Come,"
said his host,
"if you're in the complimentary line, you'll get on here, for you'll meet with no competition. I've never been in the way of learning compliments myself, and I don't profess to understand the art of paying 'em. In fact, despise 'em. But your bricking up was different from mine. Mine was a real thing, by George. You're a gentleman, and I don't pretend to be one. I am Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, and that's enough for me. However, though I am not influenced by manners and station, Lou Bounderby may be. She hadn't my advantages. Disadvantages you would call them, but I call them advantages. So you'll not waste your power, I dare say."
"Mr. Bounderby,"
said Jem, turning with a smile to Louisa,
"is a noble animal in a comparatively natural state, quite free from the harness in which a conventional hack like myself works."
You respect Mr. Bounderby very much?
she quietly returned.
It is natural that you should.
He was disgracefully thrown out, for a gentleman who had seen so much of the world, and thought,
"Now, how am I to take this?"
You are going to devote yourself, as I gather from what Mr. Bounderby has said, to the service of your country. You have made up your mind?"
said Louisa, still standing before him where she had first stopped, in all the singular contrariety of her self-possession, and her being obviously very ill at ease.
"To show the nation the way out of all its difficulties."
"Mrs. Bounderby,"
he returned, laughing.
"Upon my honour, no. I will make no such pretence to you. I have seen a little, here and there, up and down. I have found it all to be very worthless, as everybody has, and as some confess they have, and some do not. And I am going in for your respected father's opinions. Really because I have no choice of opinions, and may as well back them as anything else."
"Have you none of your own?"
asked Louisa.
"I have not so much as the slightest predilection left. I assure you I attach not the least importance to any opinions. The result of the varieties of boredom I have undergone is a conviction, unless conviction is too industrious a word for the lazy sentiment I entertain on the subject, that any set of ideas will do just as much good as any other set, and just as much harm as any other set. There's an English family with a charming Italian motto: what will be, will be. It's the only truth going."
The vicious assumption of honesty in dishonesty, a vice so dangerous, so deadly, and so common, seemed, he observed, a little to impress her in his favour. He followed up the advantage by saying in his pleasantest manner, a manner to which she might attach as much or as little meaning as she pleased,
"The side that can prove anything in the line of units, tens, hundreds, and thousands, Mrs. Bounderby, seems to me to afford the most fun, and to give a man the best chance. I am quite as much attached to it as if I believed it. I am quite as ready to go in for it to the same extent as if I believed it. And what more could I possibly do if I did believe it?"
"You are a singular politician,"
said Louisa.
"Pardon me, I have not even that merit. We are the largest party in the state, I assure you, Mrs. Bounderby. If we all fell out of our adopted ranks and were reviewed together—"
Mr. Bounderby, who had been in danger of bursting in silence, interposed here with a project for postponing the family dinner till 6:30, and taking Mr. James Harthouse, in the meantime, on a round of visits to the voting and interesting notabilities of Coketown and its vicinity. The round of visits was made, and Mr. James Harthouse, with a discreet use of his blue coaching, came off triumphantly, though with a considerable accession of boredom. In the evening he found the dinner-table laid for 4, but they sat down only 3. It was an appropriate occasion for Mr. Bounderby to discuss the flavour of the ha'porth of stewed eels he had purchased in the streets at 8 years old, and also of the inferior water, specially used for laying in the dust, with which he had washed down that repast. He likewise entertained his guest over the soup and fish, with the calculation that he, Bounderby, had eaten in his youth at least 3 horses under the guise of Polonaise and saveloys. These recitals Jem, in a languid manner, received with
"Charming"
every now and then, and they probably would have decided him to go in for Jerusalem again to-morrow morning, had he been less curious respecting Louisa.
"Is there nothing,"
he thought, glancing at her as she sat at the head of the table, where her youthful figure, small and slight, but very graceful, looked as pretty as it looked misplaced,
"is there nothing that will move that face?"
Yes, by Jupiter, there was something, and here it was, in an unexpected shape. Tom appeared. She changed as the door opened, and broke into a beaming smile. A beautiful smile. Mr. James Harthouse might not have thought so much of it, but that he had wondered so long at her impassive face. She put out her hand, a pretty little soft hand, and her fingers closed upon her brother's, as if she would have carried them to her lips.
"Ay, ay,"
thought the visitor.
"this whelp is the only creature she cares for. So, so."
The whelp was presented, and took his chair. The appellation was not flattering, but not unmerited.
"When I were your age, young Tom,"
said Bounderby,
"I was punctual, or I got no dinner."
"When you were my age,"
resumed Tom,
"you hadn't a wrong balance to get right, and hadn't to dress afterwards."
"Never mind that now,"
said Bounderby.
"Well then,"
grumbled Tom,
"don't begin with me."
"Mrs. Bounderby,"
said Harthouse, perfectly hearing this understrain as it went on,
"your brother's face is quite familiar to me. Can I have seen him abroad? Or at some public school, perhaps?"
"No,"
she resumed, quite interested.
"he has never been abroad yet, and was educated here at home. Tom, love, I am telling Mr. Harthouse that he never saw you abroad."
"No such luck, sir,"
said Tom. There was little enough in him to brighten her face, for he was a sullen young fellow, and ungracious in his manner, even to her. So much the greater must have been the solitude of her heart, and her need of some one on whom to bestow it.
"So much the more is this whelp the only creature she has ever cared for,"
thought Mr. James Harthouse, turning it over and over.
"So much the more, so much the more."
Both in his sister's presence, and after she had left the room, the whelp took no pains to hide his contempt for Mr. Bounderby, whenever he could indulge it without the observation of that independent man, by making wry faces or shutting one eye. Without responding to these telegraphic communications, Mr. Harthouse encouraged him much in the course of the evening, and showed an unusual liking for him. At last, when he rose to return to his hotel, and was a little doubtful whether he knew the way by night, the whelp immediately proffered his services as a guide, and turned out with him to escort him thither. End of Chapter 2.